Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Safety and Health webcast, Safety and the Supervisor, Developing Frontline Leadership Skills to Improve Safety Outcomes, sponsored by Safestart. This is Alan Ferguson, Associate Editor at Safety and Health Magazine. I will moderate today's presentation. First, we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and on behalf of the National Safety Council, whose employees are currently working away from the office, we hope that you, your loved ones, and all the people in your lives are remaining safe and healthy wherever they are. We'll start the presentation in a couple of minutes, but first there are some housekeeping items. As a disclaimer, the views of today's speaker and organization are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the National Safety Council or Safety and Health Magazine. Any mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean the Council or the magazine endorses those items. After today's presentation, we'll conduct a question and answer session with our speaker. To ask a question, simply type it in the text box on the left-hand side of your screen and click the button for Submit Question. Please feel free to ask your question anytime during this presentation. You don't have to wait for the Q&A to begin. Now, we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. We might not get to every question. The good news is that any unanswered questions will be forwarded to today's sponsor. If you have any technical issues during this webcast, please refer to our list of helpful tips on the right-hand portion of your screen. And for basic troubleshooting information, click the Help button located at the bottom. And after this presentation, you'll be asked to complete a brief evaluation survey, and I'll tell you more about that a little later. This webcast will be archived so you can access it after today's live event. To view this webcast and all of our past webcasts, please go to safetyandhealthmagazine.com/events. And finally, our sponsor, Safestart, is providing links to additional information, which you can find under the Resources widget on your screen. With that, let's introduce our speaker. With us today is Chris Ross. For more than 35 years, Chris has served as a performance consultant, trainer, lecturer, presenter, and keynote speaker for audiences around the U.S. and Canada. He has also consulted with more than 800 organizations, authored more than 100 articles, and is a member of the National Ski Patrol Hall of Fame. Again, we thank you all for tuning in to this presentation. Chris, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Hey, thanks, Alan, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for attending. I think it's going to be a great session because we're going to be talking about what I think is the most important person in your organization who has the most effect on your outcomes, and that is your frontline supervisor. My agenda for the day, and you've read this in the program description, but I want to talk about how human factors affect safety, quality, and performance. The human factors are really an overarching concern for all of us, and especially supervisors, and talk about why supervisors need to actively manage those human factors. Another piece that's really critical is becoming familiar with what we've determined are 6 of the key safety climate success factors that really contribute to achieving positive influences and results, and how to use learning loops in the organization. And the last piece is incorporating skills and concepts into the way you lead safety and the way you coach your supervisors. So I'd like to start out, we're going to be a bit interactive, and I'd like to start out asking you, the audience, a question. And really, the question that's in the box is not the question that I want you to answer. The question I want you to answer is, what challenges are you currently facing in your organization with respect to safety? What safety challenges do you have? And just enter those into the text box. What safety challenges do you face in your organization? I'll give you about 20, 25 seconds for that. Great responses. Fabulous responses. Okay, keep those responses coming in. A lot of really clear trends coming out with the responses. A lot around buy-in culture, complacency, accountability, and now there's certainly a lot of COVID questions and concerns coming in, enforcement, support, and a couple of folks writing in about safety for remote workers and remote sites, which is really a big issue. So here's the ones I keep seeing over and over and over again, and a lot of you guys have hit this. Overcoming a climate of blame, which is a cultural thing. We've always done it this way, which is also tied into your cave people. And I believe most of you have cave people working for you. Those are the citizens against virtually everything. Difficult conversations, conflicting priorities showed up a lot in your list. New responsibilities, making the transition from peer to supervisor. Getting buy-in for safety from workers, and I would guess that about 25% of the comments so far have been about getting buy-in. Ineffective systems, which ties back to culture. Shortcuts and rule breaking shows up a lot, with accountability and all of its ancillary issues, and senior leader buy-in and participation. All of those represent some challenges for us, and let's talk about some ways to get a little better at it. So we define at Safestart human factors as the people elements of systems and conditions that influence performance and reliability. So the human factors framework, if you go from left to right, is influenced by systems, and the system factors I'll talk about in just a moment, and individual factors. So system factors and individual factors interplay with each other, which result in actions, behaviors, results, which affect all the way at the right side of this illustration, outcome, reliability. So two important things in this illustration to really pay attention to is the organizational learning loop at the bottom. And that's how we learn from ourselves. Peter Senge, in his book, The Fifth Discipline, writes about creating learning organizations. How do we learn best from ourselves? And I mean learning from ourselves not only in times of crisis, but learning from what works best. And then the individual learning loop is how individuals learn from their mistakes and successes. So those are really critical to enhance if we're going to get better outcome reliability. In other words, we want to learn from ourselves. So let's take a look at organizational learning loop elements. So these are the human conditions and system conditions that exist within the organization. So culture, effectiveness. A huge one is expectations and consequences. What are the norms that are expected in our organization? Feedback. How do shift meetings go? I've been on site over 800 different locations, and one of the common complaints I hear is we have a daily tailgate meeting, we have shift handover meeting, and we just don't get participation in those meetings. So that's a cultural event. And then there's system conditions. Tools, resources, work design, workflow, software, performance standards, and then shift work and fatigue is added into that. You can see some of these are brought on by the organization, but some of these, like the current pandemic situation, is brought on from outside sources. These system conditions, both the human conditions and the system technical conditions, contribute to outcome reliability and affect how people are performing. The interesting thing about this diagram and looking in human conditions and internal factors is that it aligns to personal motivation. Can I do it? Can I do it? Will I do it? Do I have enough information to do it? So in the individual learning loop, we have internal factors which are both physical and psychological. So physical states like fatigue or a fast pace or decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is something that's really happening in the workplace a lot now with the COVID crisis because people are being forced to make decisions rapidly and endlessly, and it really creates some issues. And then there's psychological states like frustration or overconfidence or biases or assumption. These internal factors affect our processing. So these internal factors cause us to respond in certain, usually scripted ways. So they become our plan of operation, our habit. We go on autopilot when we're faced with something like this. So as an example, you've all got somebody who knows how to push your buttons, whoever that might be, and that creates kind of an automatic response. So if we use that internal learning loop to learn from when these factors affect our decision-making and our actions, we can change how these internal factors affect our processing and therefore get better results and better actions. So part of this is an internal self loop, but a lot of this also ties back to the supervisor recognizing when employees, when these workers are in one of these internal factors, one of the physical states or psychological states, they can help bring awareness to it. We'll talk about how that works in a couple of different ways. Let's talk about culture for a minute, and culture versus climate. A lot of you mentioned some of the challenge is around the culture and the climate of the organization. I define culture as the way things are around here. It's just the way things are done. Culture is a long-term, long-lasting, big ship to drive. Whereas climate is the pulse of what's important today. Climate is like the weather. Climate changes instantly. So supervisors have the greatest influence on climate because they're at the front line, but the leaders need to drive expectations of performance and change. So there goes that whole piece about accountability again. Accountability and performance. Enhancing communication is a huge driver of climate change. In the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations I've been in, I think it comes down to communication again and again and again. Those with a good climate and culture of communication do really well. Those who have flawed communication skills and processes don't fare as well. And I believe that climate has changed one conversation at a time. Culture has changed one conversation at a time. Every time a supervisor or a leader speaks, that is either enhancing the desired climate or it's tearing down the desired climate. So it's really critical to understand the supervisor's role in driving the climate. Organizations talk about wanting to change the culture. That's a really lagging indicator, but climate is instant and virtual. So Ed Schein, one of my gurus about culture, talks about culture best being represented as an iceberg. So if I come into your plant or your location, I can visibly see the behaviors, rituals, slogans, the way people dress, the way they talk to each other. That's the visible top 10%. But the culture is influenced by the norms, beliefs, and core values. As an example, most organizations have employee orientation that lasts anywhere from a couple hours to a couple of weeks. They go through orientation and they go out on the shop floor, and what do they learn on the shop floor? How things are really done around here. So that reinforces the beliefs that either I'll get in trouble for doing something or not get in trouble for doing something. And at the base of this is the individual's core values and assumptions. So my definition of insanity, and we've tried this for years and years and years, is that we've tried to influence behavior at the point of behavior as opposed to influencing the mindset of the individuals involved, which I think is a far more promising output. So the 6 climate factors we've identified as really influencing the climate and therefore having a possibility of changing the culture are to communicate positively and avoiding blame, identifying hazards and evaluating risk in real time. Several of you mentioned risk assessment as a barrier. We'll talk about some ways to enhance that. Leveraging systems data and reporting and having better systems that really create opportunities in that organizational learning loop to learn from ourselves. Engaging workers with open communication and demonstrating a personal commitment and leading by examples. So these 6 climate factors are driven by supervisors and result in a change in the climate. So the first one, communicating positively and avoiding blame. I'm going to wind up here in just a minute for a question for you, which I'll preface in just a minute. So the general question for you, do supervisors tend to resolve the issues or assign blame? How do we respond to bad news? One of my instant culture climate measurements is good news welcome? Is bad news welcome? Is bad news welcome as an opportunity to improve, or do we shoot the messenger? Many of you operate work trucks in your locations, and as I go around plants, I notice that there happens to be something missing from the back of the fork truck, and you've all identified what that is. It no longer has paint on it. So my question for the purchasing director at your plant, did it come that way with no paint, or was that an unreported near miss? So how do we respond to reports, near misses, and injuries? So on the lower right-hand console, I want you to respond with a number in the group chat area. What's your culture of blame in your organization? So enter a response ranging from 1 to 5. 1 is low, meaning that there's lots of blame when things go wrong, and 5 is we don't blame people. So take just a minute and throw out some numbers in there, and I'll take a quick aggregate of what the average is. And it's from 1 to 5. Somebody got a 7. That's great. Okay, 3s, 4s, 2s, 3s, 1s. Okay, pretty much in the median. Yeah, some 1s come through. Yeah, great stuff. Well, With a population this size, as you can imagine, the answers are all over the place. So my question to you is, what would you like to do about it, and how do you perceive the way forward to move that, and is that a number worth moving? I believe it's a number worth moving. I think that's a huge underpinning to the climate. And someone just wrote in, depends on who's there. Senior leaders tend to be a 1, safety is a 5. And that's a great insight, because if you ask this question of managers, you will get a completely different number than you get it for supervisors, and you will get a completely different number if you ask this of employees. So it's a worthwhile question to ask. So here's some things supervisors can do. Practice, and supervisors, managers, and all of us can practice being less reactive. In these days, tensions are high during the pandemic, and it's a natural reaction to want to just react. So supervisors should take a deep breath and think about what they're going to say. One of my mentors for years and years and years, I was fortunate enough to meet and work with Stephen Covey. And he always talked about one of the 7 habits was seek first to understand. And he talks about the ability as humans have of taking that pause between stimulus and response. And a lot of organizations actually have slogans like take 2 or take 5, talking about being less reactive. So in that context, it's about taking 2 minutes or taking 5 minutes to do a quick objective risk assessment. But in a communication perspective, taking 2 can mean, or taking 5 can mean taking just a few seconds to think about what your response is going to be. The other piece is to really talk about when things are going right. I ask organizations, how much time do you focus on when things are going right? The perception that the people who have the answer on this is that they are giving lots of good positive feedback. That's the perception. So I've done perhaps training for 10,000 supervisors over my career. And one of the things I teach supervisors, and I think it's one of the most important things, is that perhaps positive feedback is one of the most useful and underused tools on the planet. So giving positive feedback is about recognizing and catching somebody doing something right. So one of my mentors taught me, start out with 5 pennies in your right pocket, and every time you give somebody a piece of positive feedback, move the penny to the left pocket, and your objective is to go home with the 5 pennies change. So whether it's 5 pennies a day or whether you put 5 pennies on the on your desk, the idea is to give those pieces of positive feedback. Because I ask organizations, how well are you at giving positive feedback? And they say really well. And then I go out and I ask employees. And I'll ask, when was the last time you got a piece of positive feedback for your safety behavior from your direct supervisor? Was it today? Was it this week? Was it this month? Was it this year? Was it ever? And the answer is pretty discouraging. There's not a lot of positive feedback. And the studies have shown, the Boeing study, the OSHA study, again and again and again, is that positive feedback from the direct supervisor is one of the best ways to happiness. So positive feedback, thinking about opportunities for recognizing and catching people doing something right is huge. So turning back to human factors for just a moment, those internal factors, the physical states and the psychological states, should be integrated into hazard assessment. So lots of organizations have inspections and hazard hunts. But do supervisors observe tasks, and as they're observing the task, try to appreciate what internal factors are going on? So this is just an exercise in training your eyes. So it's going out and looking at a task and then just putting yourself in that worker's shoes. Are they hot? Is it uncomfortable? Does it take a lot of strain to get there? Does it require a huge amount of mental acuity, or is this something that robots could do and people become just complacent to it? So the question is, what are those internal factors that are in place in the moment in that task? And when supervisors start to do this, they start to appreciate their workers' internal factors in a whole new way, and then can help their workers with addressing these internal factors. So these internal factors, again, the physical states and the psychological states, we're in one or more of these states absolutely every day, if not a dozen times a day. Especially in these days of pandemic and stress and uncertainty and fear, talking about it, reassuring workers, understanding where these internal factors lead to processing and actions is more important now than ever before. So training the eyes of the supervisors to recognize these and helping to enhance that little dotted line over on the right, which is that internal learning loop. So it would be ideal if we can get workers to handle their own internal learning loop, but sometimes we need a little help from outside, and that's where the supervisor comes in. The other piece, as we're identifying hazards and evaluating risks, is to incorporate the hierarchy of controls when you're doing a task observation. So if you're doing a task observation or a daily task hazard analysis or even a JSA, always going back to the hierarchy of controls and questioning it. So I know we won't always be able to get at the zenith of this, but it's worth challenging it again and again and again and again. So looking at a task, I was in a plant a couple of months ago, and these workers were attaching roofing, which was insulation board and plywood, into steel, not metal, not aluminum, but steel studs overhead. So they had a lifting device. They were standing on ladders. They had to use an impact hammer to force the screw into the metal stud, and about 6 out of 7 screws failed. So it was hot, it was hard work, it was overhead, it was awkward, it was a difficult situation. I went back later in the day, and they had only made it halfway through the roof. So this was a terribly laborious project, hard project. So as I was standing there with a supervisor, we talked about, so what could you do to improve this? We talked about, better screws, better guns, better, staging scaffolding, all sorts of improvement possibilities. And one of the folks that was standing with us said, I worked at an air conditioner factory, and we had this rotating rotating device, and it would actually take these 1,500-pound air conditioning units and swivel them 180 degrees so the bottom then became the top. What if we made a rotating thing and rotated these containers so the bottom or the top was now on the bottom, and they just laid this stuff down and used their body weight? So sure, this thing probably would cost, I don't know, $200,000 or whatever to build, but just think of the labor savings and the time savings. And so that would be this perfect kind of combination of engineering substitution and elimination of really changing that hazard. So I really want supervisors to understand the hierarchy of controls. All of us who are safety professionals get it, and we've totally got it. But if every time the supervisor or the team leader is going through their daily or job task hazard analysis, whatever they're doing, and they talk about what the hazards and the control methods are, always thinking about, so is there a way to move this up the hierarchy of controls? That is the perfect example of utilizing the organizational learning loop to get better and better and better. So let's talk about systems, data, and reporting. So how effective is our organization in designing effective reporting systems? What does near miss look like? And how do we encourage near misses? So I want you to think about all of the systems in place, not just near miss reporting, but meetings, calls for employee input. How are these gathered? So this again speaks directly to the organizational learning loop. And the question is, how effective is it? Do these systems tend to encourage and reward reporting? And I don't mean rewarding in a monetary way. I mean rewarding in a recognition kind of way. Or are they punishing to do? I've looked at many near-miss systems that are so overly burdensome. They're like 3-page documents, and if somebody reports a near-miss, there'll be an inquisition. So it's about really tidying up these systems. So follow-up is huge. I was in a plant, this was a couple of years ago, they were getting ready to implement some new systems, and I said, so one of the things that will happen as a result of doing these observations is it's going to create quite a punch list. It will create a lot of interest in maintenance items. So do you currently track open maintenance items and suggestions? And they said, oh yeah, we've got a spreadsheet that tracks that. I said, great. They said, yeah, we have over 300 open items. Oh, not great. So yeah, they had the system in place, but it was not working. But people like to be recognized for their contribution. And if you capture those contributions on a database or a spreadsheet and they see their suggestion has been heard, it makes people really excited that they got listened to. They know that this might be a $2 million capital project and it's not going to happen this week, but they see their name in lights. So do your systems allow people to have input and follow up on issues? And of course, we talked about removing barriers as a huge piece. And we also need to talk about not assigning blame. So if the employees, if the workers' suggestions are acted on, it helps to reinforce this organizational and internal learning loop. If my comments and suggestions are appreciated, it makes a huge difference. I was working with a group of supervisors in a plant several months ago, and a supervisor said during one of our discussions, he said, well, there's this guy, and he keeps making these suggestions. And honestly, they're the most lame suggestions on the planet. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, just not practical suggestions at all. And I said, well, give me an example. So he gave me an example of the suggestion the guy had made that would house a noisy motor, and it would also prevent dust escapement. And he said, well, that would just never work because it would create an enclosed explosion hazard. I said, well, so you slam the guy for making that suggestion. I said, why don't you try a different approach with him? Why don't you try the approach of listening to his suggestion and then saying, okay, well, that's a good idea. Have you thought about the explosion factor that might create and how you might address that? And see if by creating dialogue and asking open-ended questions when people are making suggestions, that you get a better outcome. So it was about 2 weeks later, he came back and he said, well, that was amazing. He said that he went back to the guy and said, he apologized for kind of cutting him off and asked the guy for some suggestions. The guy suggested putting a ventilation system within this box. And he got him talking about it, and then this guy started making suggestion after suggestion after suggestion. So the supervisor had recognized his approach to this was everything, and he changed his approach and therefore got way better communication, way better input, way better responses. Again, as I said in the beginning, your frontline supervisors are the key to this. So let's talk about near-miss reporting for just a minute. So near-miss reporting is a challenge for lots of organizations, and many of the organizations I work with and consult with would like to see an increase in near-miss reporting. In a plant of 500, I'll ask folks, well, how many near misses do you get reported? And they'll say, well, like 50. And so, in a plant of 500, there's probably 500 a day, so it's like tens of thousands. Well, all those near misses are worth talking about, but they're not necessarily worth reporting. So I like to recommend what I call a dual path near miss reporting system. So that near miss reporting system involves talking about the low stakes near misses, at-risk behaviors, bumps, scrapes, free for the looking. Those reinforce the internal learning loop and save the more SIF potential, serious injury fatality near misses, for the formal reporting system. I don't think any of you as safety managers or directors, if you're in that role, really want 10,000 near misses reported in your plant, but you do want those 10,000 discussed. So anyway, just a food for thought. I've got some articles on that. Put it in the comments if you're interested in reading more. So always discuss near misses. Make that a value that it is worth a discussion. So we're trying to enhance the climate of communication and take actions and lead by example. So instead of saying, did anyone have a near miss, it's what near misses did you have, and leading with your own. So engaging workers in open communication is a huge piece. So this is really all about creating open dialogue. As an example that I just gave, really trying to reach out and touch people, getting them to talk, getting them to share their ideas. This building communication and trust helps build engagement. And engagement is not just about getting people to talk. It's about their willingness to go above and beyond. It's their willingness to stay with you. It's their willingness to invest their heart and soul. So open communication, listen to understand. Again, as Stephen Covey said, seek first to understand. Using open-ended questions, using all those skills. Supervisors need to have training in communication. They didn't come that way, and none of us come that way. We really need training to get better at communication, and especially listening. And I'll reinforce, we always want to talk about safety when things go wrong, but let's talk about safety when things went right. In hazardous materials cleanup, we always have the hot wash afterwards, and we talk about, what went wrong and what went right, and learn from that. And I think organizations miss a huge opportunity to talk about the things that are really working right. So again, look for things that are going right, give positive feedback, asking for input. And it's all about creating that climate of open communication. So a question for you in the chat box, so group chat lower right widget. I want you to answer this question not from your personal commitment to safety. I want to take this up a level, and I want you to answer this. How do your senior leaders demonstrate their personal commitment to safety? So take just a minute and respond in the chat box. Okay, well, these are pretty interesting responses, ranging from not very well to be supportive or else. Interesting. Okay. Well, you can see the responses here, and it's all over the place, but it's not great, and that is a piece that I'll go back to again. Creating accountability, creating a climate of open discussion, creating an expectation that there be open dialogue starts at the top. So it's one thing to train all your supervisors to do this, but the disconnect often comes at the senior level. Now, in every organization I have been with, senior leaders do absolutely care about safety. They're concerned about it. They're concerned about employees. What they don't know is how best to do it, and what they don't do particularly well is set a budget and some time for that. So one of the things you can do to help your senior leaders is to understand and share some of these concepts about how creating a climate of communication is really critical. So demonstrating personal commitment, walking the talk, really planning formal and informal opportunities for safety talks and safety walks. A lot of organizations use Gemba walks. And those create a fabulous opportunity. One of my bosses years ago had the management philosophy of management by walking around. It's brilliant. It really creates a climate. And so those of you who responded, your senior leaders are out talking to people. It creates an esprit de corps, a level of engagement that's super positive. Those of you who work in organizations where senior leaders are not visible on the floor probably recognize the wall, and that's the gap between the perception of what's happening in the C-suite and the reality of what's happening out on the floor. So find opportunities for problem solving, celebrate successes using open-ended questions. So again, the bottom line here that we've been talking about is when supervisors and leaders and managers in organizations understand and use the learning loops. So it's not only understanding the factors, but using the learning loops. Tremendous change can happen. There is so much information embedded in organizations. One of my colleagues has a quote he uses in presentations that came from, I believe, the president of Hewlett-Packard, who said, "If we only knew what we know, we could be so much more successful." So all this information is tacit information. It lives in the minds of people. So the whole piece about knowledge management and mining this information is really critical, and that calls for good communication skills, asking questions, open dialogue. So again, supervisors are on the leading edge of climate change and have the most direct influence on workers, but they are guided, and the vision has to be created by the senior leadership team. So that's what I've got for you today in terms of presentation. Thanks for coming today, and we've got a good, healthy time for your questions and my answers. So, Alan, how would you like to handle questions?
Well, first, we want to thank you, Chris, for this fantastic and extremely insightful presentation. Before you start the Q&A, I want to let everyone know about the evaluation survey. We're asking you to complete. The survey should be appearing on your screen now. Your input is important because it will help us improve our future webcast. And if you do not see the evaluation survey on your screen, please turn off your pop-up blocker. And you may also access the survey by clicking the survey button near the lower right part of your screen. Okay, now let's get to some questions. First question, what resources are there, if any, in creating JSAs that aren't so time-consuming but still extremely detailed?
So let me repeat that again, Alan. So what resources are there for effective JSAs but that are not time-consuming?
Yes, but still detailed.
Well, gosh, I've seen hundreds of JSA templates, and I guess I do favor the ones that are more. There are some that are pages long with every conceivable thing, which then becomes a punch list, which then becomes a kind of an exercise in pencil whipping. So some of the best ones, well, the best processes that I've seen go through, well, so let's define JSA versus THA. So JSA, job hazard, job safety analysis, I view as a pretty rigorous review of a task that would be done once a year, once every couple of years, that would result in updating potentially the procedures associated with that task. So that would involve going out, watching one of your key performers do the task, documenting the steps, and then translating that into the operational procedure. So that's my definition of JSA. My definition of a THA, a task hazard analysis, is something that would be done at the beginning of the shift to identify what the hazards of the particular task that the crew is working on. And in my mind, that is a really open-ended dialogue box. And in fact, the paper really guides the discussion. And I know we want to document this stuff, but the gold is in the discussion, not the paper. So it would guide the crew to talk about what hazards are out there, but it would also take people back into the internal factors. So yeah, we're gonna be putting up scaffolding today, but it's minus 25 degrees Celsius. The wind is blowing. It's our Friday. What are those human factors associated with it? So there's tons of templates and ideas for JHAs and THAs, but again, I really want to stress, it should be a decision-making process. It should involve the entire crew. It should be a discussion. So if it's just one guy filling this thing out and everybody signs it, you lose. And the other thing about a task hazard analysis is that it needs to recognize that conditions change, and there needs to be a mechanism for spotting that change and dealing with it. And if I didn't answer that question, throw it in the chat box and I'll look at it some more. Next one, Alan.
Our next question: when safety cultures are in their infancy and reporting is being developed, what is your experience with the expectation of a quote unquote perfect, or expectations on perfect reports? You know, kind of thanks for filling out the report, but dot dot dot. The question asker says his or her experience is that it becomes a deterrent. And how have you seen this in practice?
Well, yeah. So that's a really interesting question because most of us are dealing with trying to change an existing culture, which can be really hard. There's so many barriers to that. So building a new culture is in many ways much easier. So again, the tenet is that you want things reported and talked about. So every report, every discussion should be viewed as a gift. Thank you for your contribution, even if it's bad news. So I've been in a number of organizations that handle bad news really well because the deal is if you report it, you will not get in trouble. If we find out about it, that you had this occurrence and you didn't report it, then you're in trouble. So they encourage that reporting and they value everyone's contribution. So that's the piece that I think is most important. Is you want to encourage the desired behavior, and the desired behavior is open communication and dialogue. So you reward that, and I'm not saying monetarily. The biggest reward on the planet is positive recognition from someone's immediate supervisor. It's what people live for and thrive for.
Our next question. I have 33 years of experience in the field of oil and gas, and I have found that HF are overlooked and neglected. How can we improve this? So 35 years in the business and health and safety is overlooked. Does that mean at the expense, so what's taking priority is the environmental piece? Is that the question? It says it's found that HF are overlooked and neglected.
That H and S are overlooked and neglected?
No, F as in Frank. HF.
Oh, HF. Oh, that the human factors are
yes.
Overlooked. Okay, gotcha.
Yes.
Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for the phonetic shout out. Yeah, well, so, this gets back to the whole behavior-based versus HOP thing. So my background is performance improvement. My background is, I was born and bred on Thomas Gilbert and performance technology and trying to understand what those system elements are that create good outcomes or inhibit bad outcomes. So human factors from a systems perspective, human factors from an individual perspective. So one of the reasons they get overlooked is because for a time, and this is what gave behavior-based safety such a bad rap, is that those were used as blame mechanisms. And the other piece that got a bad rap is that people were focusing on the human side of things and neglecting the system side. So many in the profession said, well, we need to, take a system safety approach. But human factors are embedded in every decision, in every piece. So I think recognizing the importance of human factors as they tie, not only the individual factors, but the system factors, which are both, organizational and human in nature, are critical. So getting back into it, I think that the human factors framework, of which there's an illustration here, clearly indicates the symbiotic relationship between humans and their environment. It's critical. So not sure I answered that question because that's a long-winded answer to really get human factors back into the scale again. But human factors affect every outcome reliability for every organization.
Our next question, at what point does an at-risk behavior become a near miss?
Well, if I don't see the hose and I trip over the hose but don't fall, that's a near miss for me. So I think at-risk behaviors are closely tied into near misses, which are, again, opportunities down there where it's free for looking to talk about it. And here's why I say those at-risk behaviors and little near misses are so important to talk about. It's an interesting phenomenon in our brains that if we say something out loud, it stays in our memories. But if we don't say it out loud, it kind of disappears. So as an example, you don't need to raise your hands, y'all out there, but I'm just curious. How many of you have gone through the red light or yellow light? Raise your hand. Yes. Okay. So you all raised your hands. And what's the first thing you did? You looked back to see if there was any cops there. So, and then about 2 blocks later, we completely forgot that happened. So talking about these at-risk behaviors and near misses is so important because then it embeds it into our psyche and it reinforces that internal learning loop so that we can get better at our deal. And all those that are down there at the free for looking point are all at getting ourselves better at our deal. It's about self-improvement.
Our next question, what is a good resource in helping to improve communication skills?
Well, gosh, there's a lot of them. For 30 years, I've been teaching communication skills. I trained facilitators in Franklin Covey, in Development Dimensions International, Achieve Global. There are a jillion resources for supervisor communication training, and they are all good. And I would recommend that organizations invest in their supervisor communication skills by helping them. Anything. Community colleges are a great resource. There's federal funding available for supervisor training. There's just a ton of resources out there to help organizations help their supervisors with communication skills. Because many supervisors were anointed or blessed, so the organization took their best welder and turned them into a supervisor, and they just lost their best welder, and now they've got their worst supervisor. So investing in talent development is a huge piece. Lots of resources out there.
It looks like we have time for one more question. In your experience, what's the best way to help people buy in and kind of openly participate in incident investigations?
Yeah, well, it has to start out with what are the consequences for talking? And in organizations that blame workers and are looking to find fault, and you know who you are as an organization, it's really tough. That's a very tough piece to turn around to get people to be open about it. And again, it really gets down to latent cause investigation and asking people, what were you thinking when you did this? And not to blame, but to understand what their thinking rationale was. And then you go to their supervisor and say, so what were you thinking that allowed, your supervisor to think this? And all the way up to the CEO, what were you thinking that allowed that? Creating that climate of open communication takes work and it takes effort and it needs to start from the top. But the bottom line is it needs to start at the top that we are in this for finding the facts, not finding fault.
All right, thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's questions, but unanswered questions we forwarded to today's sponsor. Again, we also hope you take the time to share your feedback through our survey. This ends today's Safety and Health Magazine webcast. I'd like to thank Chris Ross, our sponsor, Safestart, and of course, everyone who joined us today. Take care and be safe.